All right, this is the last lesson of our East Asian Empires unit. We're going to be talking about feudal Japan today, with your goal being to be able to explain how geography, cultural borrowing, and the rise of feudalism shaped Japanese civilization. So the first question is, how did Japan's geography shape its civilization? So for this, we're going to have to go back in time quite a bit. Let's talk about geography a little bit. Japan's an archipelago, which basically means it's a series of islands. In fact, it's about 4,000 islands that make up modern Japan. But there really are four main large islands. The vast majority of the other islands are pretty small. The main islands themselves are pretty mountainous, with only about 12% of the land being farmable, so the people are more concentrated along the coastal plains. This should sound familiar to you, as this is kind of how we described Greece, so it's going to have a similar impact on their culture. They had frequent earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and typhoons in the area, creating tsunamis that shaped their respect for nature and influenced their religion. As you can see here on this chart, there's quite a few areas that are very high risk for large earthquakes. The islands themselves also have limited natural resources such as iron, oil, and coal, which will eventually encourage Japan to adapt and import ideas and resources from their neighbors. In fact, it's their closeness to China and Korea that made this cultural exchange possible, but their separation by the Sea of Japan, or also known as the East Sea, is going to provide them some protection from invasion. So they're able to benefit from the cultures that they're nearby without actually having to worry about being conquered and controlled by them. Well, they do have to worry about it, but it provides them quite a bit of protection. Next, we're going to take a look at how early religion and culture shaped Japan's identity. So early on, Japan was divided up into different clans that worshipped different kamis, or spirits, that dwelled in natural objects. This eventually combined to create the Shinto religion, known as the Way of the God. Shintoism emphasized respect for nature, family loyalty, and ancestor worship. So you're already seeing some similarities, hopefully, between Japanese culture and Chinese culture that we already studied. Now, the chief goddess for the Japanese was the goddess Amaterasu, the sun goddess, who is believed to be the ancestor of the imperial family. So, the emperor and his family are seen as descendants of the sun goddess, which gives them the divine authority to rule over everyone else. Now, religion reinforced Japan's connection to the natural world and the belief that there should be harmony between people and nature. Later, Buddhism would be brought from Korea to Japan, and it would be blended with Shintoism in order to create its own unique blend of the Buddhist faith. So, as alluded to, Chinese culture already does have quite a bit of influence over Japanese culture, so let's dive into where those connections happen. So there's quite a bit of cultural borrowing from China that occurred through Korea. So you can see how close Japan is here to Korea, brought by Korean traders and scholars beginning in the 400s Common Era. But about 200 years later, by the 600s, the royal family in Japan, of the imperial family, sent missions, people over to the Tang Dynasty, who we talked about in an earlier lesson, in order to study the Confucian government, Buddhism, and technology, and bring those ideas back to Japan. Some of the things they brought back was the Chinese writing system, the idea for Buddhist temples. As you can see here, the Chinese Buddhist temple and a Japanese Buddhist temple. They look very similar architecturally. A lot of art is modeled after Chinese styles, and even Confucian ideas about duty, loyalty, and respect for authority are all imported from China to Japan during this time. Though there are already elements of this that existed in Japan, so it's not a complete taking from China, it's more of a blending of these ideas with what already existed in Japan. The architectural designs of buildings in Japan were also inspired by China. The tea drinking that the Chinese did gets imported over to Japan, and even the way they plan their cities are modeled after the Tang Dynasty's capital. Now, Japan also attempted to copy the Chinese civil service exam in order to have bureaucrats or these gentrified people who helped run the government based on their ability to do it, not just based on the family they were born into. But in Japan, unlike China, in Japan it never was able to fully replace the hereditary power of the noble class, so the hereditary nobles still retained a lot of their power despite these efforts to bring over the civil service exam. But by the late 800s, Japan ended the formal missions to China and kind of just said, okay, we thank you so much, we got a lot from you, but we're going to go our own on this from now on. So it's around the time that they cut off these missions to China that Japan enters what we know as the Classical period. This is also known as the Heian period, which lasted from 794 Common Era to 1185 Common Era. So this is around the time the Abbasids were in control of the Islamic Caliphate. It's during this period the capital was moved to Kyoto, or Heian as it was known at the time, and this is the start of Japan's classical age, so kind of the period people think back to when they think of like classical or ancient China. It's during this time that nobles created a court culture for their own, focused on beauty, etiquette, and art, and life at court was governed by a very strict set of social rules, such as the type of clothes you could wear, how you could speak, the type of writing you would do, and how you behaved in every different situation. You see this a lot in the courts of powerful governments. They didn't really have a lot to do, so they had these rules that dictated exactly how you would dress, how you would act, how you behave, how you spoke. And that's pretty common in these courts, as we'll see in European courts when we get to the French dynasties. Art and poetry emphasize nature, sensitivity, and refinement, showing this continued Chinese influence through Confucian values and artistic style. You can also see some influence of Taoism here. In one of what's considered the world's first novel, The Tale of Genji, you see this description of love, duty, and what life was like among the nobility of this time. Now, as the nobles enjoyed luxury, the local warlords gained more power, which eventually weakened the imperial court, leading to what we know as feudalism. Let's get into that. But again, you're seeing this common pattern happen, right? So, this fracturing of centralized power into more localized power of warlords that happened over in China. So, let's take a deeper dive and look at what feudalism was and how it developed in Japan. So, feudalism is essentially a system where the land ownership is traded for loyalty in military service, and that by 1100s, imperial power weakened to the point that regional clans and landowners, known as daimyo, were able to build their own private armies to protect their estates. In exchange, peasants offered their labor and their crops for the protection of these local warlords. Local lords pretty much ruled like independent mini kings. Now, this period actually extends so far into the future that we actually have photographs of the peasants at the time and the daimyos, because this system existed until the 1800s, so cameras had been invented by then, and so we actually have pictures of this. Which means we also have pictures of the samurai class. So let's take a look at them and the role they play in Japanese society. So the word samurai itself means one who serves, and these were the warrior class, essentially the knights of this period that served their lords, their daimyo, and enforced their authority among the peasants to make sure that they did what they were supposed to do. They protected the estates of their lords, collected the taxes, and essentially maintained local order to protect the peasants from outsiders. They were supposedly lived by this code known as the Bushido Code, which means the way of the warrior, emphasizing courage and loyalty to your lord, reverence for the gods, self-discipline, honor, and generosity, and most famously, this concept of dying honorably, or seppuku, was preferred over defeat or shame in battle. So this was known as the Bushido Code. You can see how it reflects the Confucian values from China, loyalty, duty, and hierarchy, which was adopted to meet Japan's more militarized society. The samurai also were a parallel of Mongol warriors, emphasizing their discipline, obedience, and service. So you see this blending of Chinese Confucianism as well as Mongol warriors into the samurai class. From early childhood, the samurai trained in the martial arts, archery, swords, but also poetry. It was this belief that there needed to be a balance between the samurai needed to be a balance of a warrior and a scholar. Despite how they're depicted in pop culture, women in samurai families, they managed the estates, but they also could fight if necessary, and there were actually female samurai that gained notoriety for their bravery in battle. Alright, so let's talk about the shogunate system that changed Japan's government and how exactly it changed Japan's government. So, while there was always an emperor who was believed to be their family descendants of the sun goddess, this didn't last forever, right? It was the Minamoto clan that eventually emerged victorious after decades of civil war of these different warlords fighting each other. The emperor was technically still in charge, but just a figurehead. He couldn't really do anything as the warlords kept fighting amongst themselves. It was in 1192 Common Era that one of these warlords became the shogun, the supreme general of all the Japanese clans, establishing what's known as the Kamakura shogunate, which lasted from 1192 to 1333 Common Era. Again, I'm not going to be testing you on these dates. Essentially, what shogunate is a military government, a government run by the military. The emperor remained in the city of Kyoto as a religious figurehead because he was seen as the descendant of the sun goddess, but the shogun, who ruled from the city of Kamakura, was the actual leader for all intents and purposes at this time. So you had the religious leadership of the emperor in Kyoto and the military and true government leadership in Kamakura. That's why we call it the Kamakura shogunate. So this was a dual government system where the emperor was the symbolic ruler and the shogun was the actual ruler. Now the shoguns and the samurai that served them controlled the land, collected the taxes, and enforce order through military power, doing pretty much everything you expect governments to do. But make no mistake, this was basically a military dictatorship. And so while the emperor appeared to be in charge, in reality, they didn't really have any power at all. That real power, again, was held by the shoguns. And so this feudal system emphasized loyalty, duty, and protection rather than a centralized government control that we saw in the earlier imperial period of Japan or what you saw over in the dynasties in China. But as we talked about in the Mongol lessons and the Huan dynasty, let's talk now a little bit deeper about how Japan resisted the Mongol invasions and the impact this had on Japanese culture. So it's during this time that Kublai Khan was in charge of established the Huan dynasty over in China, and they demanded tribute from Japan, saying basically, we want you to be like Korea. You can be independent, sure, but you got to pay us food, resources, gold, silver, whatever you got, we'll take. And Japan said, no, we're good. We're a military culture. You want to fight? Let's fight. So the Mongols invaded twice in 1274 and 1281. Now the Mongols were a fearsome force as we learned about, and the Japanese shogunate was also pretty fearsome in their fighting skills. So this would be quite a bit of combat, quite a real war. But what the Japanese had on their side was, well, nature. As the Mongol forces went across the seas in their ships built by the Koreans, well, giant storm came out of nowhere both times and destroyed all the Mongol fleets, putting them at a huge disadvantage. Now, some forces did manage to land, but the Japanese forces were able to fight them off. So again, these winds are known as the kamikaze winds or the divine winds, showing that the Japanese believed that it was actually the gods who saved them from the Mongol invasion. This victory strengthened Japanese faith in divine protection, believing that the sun goddess had their back, and that's what protected them, and this created a sense of national unity among the Japanese people. However, the cost of fighting this war against the Mongols bankrupted the shogunate, weakening their central control over the rest of the clans. You can probably guess what happens next, right? So it's a breaking down of the system, civil war, and eventually someone comes out on top, creating a new shogunate, and just kind of keeping this whole feudal system going. So how feudal society shaped culture and daily life in Japan? Let's take a look. So Japanese society was strictly hierarchical, even more so than Chinese society. At the top, you had the emperor, who was a divine symbol of the state, but in reality didn't have any real power. Below him was the shogun, the military ruler, who had the real authority in their society. Below the shogun, the different areas were divided among the daimyos, the warlords that held most of the land, and then had samurai that served them in order to keep control of these territories. At the very bottom were the peasants who grew all the food, did all the work, and this was the vast majority of the people. And at the bottom of the hierarchy were merchants and artisans, so they were seen as having a lower status in society than the peasants because, well, peasants made food, artisans made objects, merchants just sold stuff, and Confucian values said that was of less worth to society than those who actually, made things for a living. So unlike some societies where merchants were above the peasants, in this culture they were actually seen as below them. Zen Buddhism influenced samurai values, emphasizing meditation, discipline, and inner peace. Art and architecture reflected simplicity, and there was a focus. So, for instance, things like Zen gardens, calligraphy, art, the tea ceremony, all this was designed as a way to kind of reflect simplicity and focus on nature and inner peace. However, just like we saw happen in China, women's status declined under feudalism. Women, especially the women in the noble families, the wealthier families, were expected to be obedient to their fathers or husbands, didn't really have a lot of independence. Now, women in poorer peasant classes, they had to do a lot more work because that was necessary for survival, but among the nobility, the women didn't really have a lot of control over their lives. Japan continued to trade and borrow with ideas from China while remaining politically independent. So there you see a lot of similarities with China and Korea, but they developed their own independent style thanks to the isolation created by being on a separate island off the mainland. This feudal period has a lasting legacy on Japan's culture, so let's take a look at that. This feudal structure actually lasted until 1868, so for reference, that's 3 years after the American Civil War ends. So this system lasts for a very long time. It's why we can have actual photographs of Japanese peasants, samurai. Here you see a female samurai or the noble classes in photographs, not paintings or drawings. It's this feudal system that had values of loyalty, honor, discipline, and duty that formed the Bushido Code and shaped Japanese education, their military, and even their business culture. This reverberates even to modern day Japanese culture. It also shows how adaptable their culture is, right? They are willing to borrow from Chinese civilization, Korean civilization, defend against the Mongols, and this prepared them for the future modernization. You can see here samurai in drawings using guns. And then even in through talking about modern times, right? Post World War II, Japanese culture quickly adapts the best parts of American culture and capitalism, and they make it their own thing, right? They take from others and they improve on it by injecting their own unique culture onto it. This is a very adaptable culture. So if we're taking a step back at this entire unit, you can see how the Tang, Song dynasties, how the Mongols and Japanese societies, they all reflect how trade, conquest, and cultural exchange linked all these East Asian cultures. It's together they form one continuous regional story, so you can't really study them in isolation from each other. China provided political and philosophical models, the Mongols connected East Asia through trade and empire, and Japan adopted these influences into its own long lasting tradition. All right, that's the end of the unit. So, as always, rewrite the goal, type it out, type out those three complete thoughts, complete sentences, what you learned. So, think about what the most important things were, and then stop and think what's one question you still have. Help yourself integrate this information into your brain. Come to class, and we'll review for the test. And yeah, we're coming near the end of the semester here. Good luck, and we'll see you soon.